All in for Eric Shawn. A Navy spokesman says the victims may have been killed by the impact of the collision or drowned in flooding after the Fitzgerald sustained what officials describe as extensive damage. They say the crew had to fight to keep the destroyer afloat in the chaotic moments after the collision. Leah Gabriel is live in our New York City newsroom with the latest. Leah, what more do we know?
Well, Rick, the Navy is not yet saying how many bodies were recovered. That's until family members can be notified. The 7 sailors who went missing are now presumed dead. This collision between the U.S. Navy guided missile destroyer and a Philippine flagship 4 times its size happened about 60 miles off the coast of Japan. It was in the middle of the night, around 2:30 a.m. when most of the crew was sleeping. It took 16 hours, but the crew managed to get the Fitzgerald back to its home port in Yokosuka, Japan. Take a listen to how the Navy's 7th Fleet commander described the damage.
It was a significant impact to the side of the ship, and you can't see most of the damage. The damage is mostly underneath the waterline, and it's a large gash near the keel of the ship, and so the water flow was tremendous, and so there wasn't a lot of time in those spaces that were open to the sea.
Now, a number of sailors were injured. 3 who were severely injured had to be airlifted after the collision. That included the commanding officer, who was in his stateroom, and that was destroyed. Rick?
The images of that damage are horrific. It's remarkable the ship stayed afloat, and this isn't the first incident that we've seen near Japan recently involving the U.S. Navy. No,
it's not, Rick. The USS Fitzgerald collision is actually the 3rd mishap involving Navy warships in the region since February. In February, in fact, USS Antietam damaged its propellers and spilled hydraulic oil into the ocean. That was after it ran aground off the coast of Japan. And then just last month, USS Lake Champlain hit a South Korean fishing boat near the Korean Peninsula. Well, in the case of USS Fitzgerald, the commander of the Navy's 7th Fleet says the Navy doesn't yet know how much warning the crew had, and that should come out in the investigation, Rick.
All right, Leah, thank you very much.
Doctors say Congressman Steve Scalise is improving. They've upgraded his condition from critical to serious. The House Majority Whip wounded in a shooting as the GOP congressional baseball team was practicing in Virginia Wednesday. Molly Henneberg is live now in Washington with more. Molly?
Hi, Arthel. Doctors say Congressman Scalise faces a long road ahead, more surgeries and rehabilitation. But he's alive, as are the others who were shot. And as you said, Congressman Scalise was upgraded yesterday from critical to serious condition. Many are praising the armed Capitol Hill police officers who were part of Scalise's security detail.
I thank God every day those 2 Capitol policemen, Agent Bailey and Agent Griner, were there to save us all. I hope and pray that we can take this day, this tragedy that could have been much, much worse, and turn it into an opportunity to come together as Americans, because no one, I don't care what side you're on, no one deserves to have the violence that we all experienced just 4 short days ago.
The gunman, a 66-year-old man from Illinois, was shot by police and later died. He appears to have been targeting Republicans and had been a volunteer on Democratic Socialist Bernie Sanders' presidential campaign. Sanders said today he has not been contacted by law enforcement about the shooter.
Not in touch with me. I am not aware that they have been in touch with my staff. And I just want to wish Representative Scalise a very, very quick recovery. What happened was a tragedy, unacceptable. There should not be any violence associated with politics in America.
Scalise is out of sedation enough to watch some baseball. According to his Twitter account yesterday, the Louisiana congressman was watching baseball on TV and cheering on his alma mater, LSU, in the College World Series. Arthel?
Go Tigers, and we wish Steve Scalise a full recovery and prayers to him and his family.
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks, Molly.
Yeah.
President Trump spending the weekend at Camp David for the first time. The trip capping a busy week for the White House, both for the president's agenda and in regards to the Russia probe. Kristen Fisher is live at the White House. Kristen, how is President Trump's legal team reacting today?
Well, today, for the very first time since President Trump's big tweet on Friday, where he seemed to imply that he was the target of an investigation, today, for the very first time, a member of President Trump's personal legal team went on camera to defend or try to clarify that tweet. Jay Sekulow hit every single Sunday show and said pretty much the same thing, that the president has not been notified that he is under investigation for obstruction of justice or anything else by the special counsel.
The president has not been notified by anyone that he's under investigation. That tweet, Chris, was in response to the Washington Post story that alleged that 5 unnamed sources, anonymous sources, leaked to the Washington Post that the president was in fact under investigation. So that tweet was in response to that.
However, less than a minute later on Fox News Sunday, Sekulow said something that seemed to contradict that very clarification.
He's being investigated for taking the action that the Attorney General and Deputy Attorney General recommended him to take by the agency who recommended the termination. No investigation.
What's the question? I mean,
sure.
you've stated some facts. First of all, you've now said that he is being investigated after saying that you didn't.
No.
You just said,
no, he's
sir,
not being
that
investigated.
So things clearly got a little bit heated. The big takeaway, though, I think, is that what the president's legal team is saying is that the president has not been notified that he's under investigation, but that still doesn't mean that he is under investigation or perhaps could be in the future. As Sekulow conceded today, his direct quote, "I can't read the mind of the special prosecutor." Rick?
Color me confused. He's either being investigated or he isn't.
I tried to clarify for you, sorry.
Is the president saying anything about this today?
Yes, for the 4th time in 4 days, President Trump took to Twitter to call the investigation that's being led by his own Justice Department a witch hunt. The direct quote, "The Make America Great Again agenda is doing very well despite the distraction of the witch hunt. Many new jobs, high business enthusiasm, massive regulation cuts, 36 new legislative bills signed, great new Supreme Court justice and infrastructure, health care, tax cuts in the works." So he's really trying to shift the attention back to his agenda. You can see there he left the White House for Camp David yesterday, which is where he's spending Father's Day with his son Barron and the First Lady before heading back to D.C. later tonight. Rick?
Kristen, you may have the toughest job, toughest assignment at Fox today. Thanks very much for that.
My pleasure.
Okay, Rick and Kristen. Meanwhile, the Senate GOP trying to shift the focus away from the Russia investigation towards former Attorney General Loretta Lynch and questions of her involvement in the Hillary Clinton email scandal. Lawmakers seizing on the testimony of former FBI Director James Comey that Lynch told him to refer to the Clinton investigation as a, quote, matter. And Senator John Cornyn now calling for the former Attorney General to testify, telling the Hill, quote, frankly, a lot of what Hillary Clinton was exposed to by Director Comey's misconduct and the way he handled that was apparently in response to his lack of confidence in the Attorney General. And I think there is a lot we could learn from that, end quote. Joining us now is Elizabeth Harrington. She's the staff writer for the Washington Free Beacon. Elizabeth, nice to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start here. Is this a justified examination of former AG Loretta Lynch's tarmac conversation with President Bill Clinton, or is it a distraction from the Russia investigations?
Well, I think it is justified because it's not only Republicans who are calling for Loretta Lynch to testify, it's also Democrats. You had the leading Democrat, Dianne Feinstein, suggest that she needs to come in and they need to get to the bottom of this because it is new information that we got from James Comey's testimony. One of the biggest pieces of new information was that because Loretta Lynch directed him to call it a matter and not an investigation, which sounded an awful lot like the Hillary Clinton campaign talking points, that made James Comey very uncomfortable, concerned. I think he said, used the word queasy, but he followed the order anyway. And since we have this new information under oath, I think that's why you have both the Democrats and Republicans saying they need to find more information about this.
Well, speaking of under oath, what is the likelihood of former Attorney General Lynch testifying before the Senate Judiciary Committee?
Well, you have Senator Chuck Grassley, who's the head of the Judiciary Committee, saying they're not quite there yet, and it'll be his decision, along with other Republicans, if they do take that step. But I think Republicans will want to be pushing him to do that, but I also think Loretta Lynch really probably has no interest in testifying because I think Democrats think this is old news and irrelevant. But so I think it remains to be seen. I don't think she's going to want to be forthcoming, but we'll have to see if Chuck Grassley makes that move.
Yeah, to your point, why didn't they go after Ms. Lynch 6 or 7 months ago?
Right, and I think it's because we didn't have this information. I think James Comey's testimony brought this to light, and we also had a New York Times article that was just back in April that touched on this issue of calling the Clinton investigation a matter. And what was also in that article revealed that when the Loretta Lynch and the Justice Department first started looking into the Clinton email scandal back in July of 2015, they also used the same language to call it, it's a referral, but it's not a criminal referral, and it's only looking at classified information if that was abused. So that, again, from the very beginning, we're learning that the Justice Department under the Obama administration was using language that was not typical for Justice Departments to use, because the FBI they are the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It's not matter, it's not a review, and it sounded an awful lot like the Clinton talking points.
Well, the reports I read that Ms. Lynch said that these were terminology used to not to inflame the situation.
Right. She was saying that we don't confirm or deny investigations, but at the same time, they're so eerily similar to the Clinton campaign talking points. And you also had James Comey, his friend, tell the New York Times that, wait a minute, what are we, the Federal Bureau of Matters now? And they kind of laughed at this because it was unusual.
Well, it's very serious, of course. And if the big picture, Elizabeth, is whether the Justice Department is skewing away from law and order and perhaps leaning towards political alignments, how do lawmakers suggest correcting that?
I think they need to get to the bottom of what happened so people know exactly what the facts were and to put a stop to it. I don't know how you can put a stop to it if this was political, if it was political then, if it's political now. The facts need to come to light so people can be held accountable.
Okay, Elizabeth Harrington, we have to leave it there. Thank you.
You bet.
Rick? Agenda. At least 50,000 customers losing power as severe thunderstorms sweep through parts of Missouri overnight, downing trees and power lines in the Kansas City metro area. Many homes also damaged. And Britain's trade minister says exterior paneling banned in the UK may have been used on the London high-rise where at least 58 people died in a fire last Wednesday. The banned material, reportedly part of a renovation completed last year. The cause of that fire is still being investigated.
A new report saying there's some disagreement in the Trump administration on how to handle Iran's influence in Syria. Some staffers at the National Security Council are calling for military action in southern Syria to fight Iranian forces there. But Defense Secretary James Mattis has reportedly rejected that idea. Joining us now is Ambassador John Bolton, former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations and a Fox News contributor. Ambassador, welcome.
Good morning.
According to a report by Foreign Policy, Iran is believed to have thousands of militia in southern Syria propping up the regime of Bashar al-Assad, and these militia have been firing on U.S. forces. So why not go on the offensive, as these two national security staffers cited in the report have urged Secretary Mattis to do?
Well, if that report is accurate, I think they have assessed the overall situation correctly. It's not moving in a direction consistent with American strategic interest. But what our response is, I think, needs a little bit more study. The fact is, we have been following a policy under Barack Obama and now in the current administration of supporting the government of Iraq's effort to push ISIS out of western Iraq into Syria. I think that is not consistent with American interests, because as we increase the space controlled by the Baghdad government, we're ironically increasing the influence of Iran. And what the Iranians are trying to do with Shia militia from Iraq, with their own forces, with Hezbollah coming out of Lebanon into Syria, and with the Assad regime itself, is get a continuous space controlled by Iran or its surrogates, stretching from Iran all the way to the Mediterranean. And that's what's going on in eastern and southern Syria now. This is a big problem because this is laying the foundation, after ISIS is defeated, for the next war. Our assistance to the Baghdad government is actually facilitating that, and I think that's a big problem that we do not at the moment appear to have a strategy to handle.
But it seems pretty simple that if U.S. troops are being forced to defend themselves against attacks, why wouldn't they take the fight to the enemy, to the source of those attacks?
Well, obviously they're going to defend themselves, but I don't think we have the capability, unless news reports about our level of strength in Syria have been inaccurate to go on the offensive anywhere. We're only supposed to have a couple of thousand primarily advisory troops in the region. I think that's why we really do need a reconceptualization of what our anti-ISIS strategy ought to be. I do not think we should be relying on Iraqi forces or Shia militia or anybody associated with them. I think we need more help from other Arab countries and from the Kurds, because, as I say, even though our objective today, quite properly, is the speediest destruction of ISIS possible, the next conflict is waiting in the wings, and it's being orchestrated by the Iranians, including these militias who are attacking our forces now.
Right, and President Trump has said repeatedly that he wants to take a tougher stance on Iran. So wouldn't this be a way to do that, battling Iranian militia on the ground in southern Syria?
Well, again, if this report is correct, that'd be tough to do if his Secretary of Defense opposes it. I don't think we should get lost in a tactical issue of do we attack today or tomorrow Iranian-backed militias in Syria. I think we need a larger anti-Iran strategy, a post-ISIS strategy that will put us and our friends and allies in the region in a position to deal with the threat that the Iranian-led axis poses, because it's a real one. It's not only the conventional military threat, it's their terrorist capabilities. Iran has long been the central banker of international terrorism, and obviously the Iranian nuclear weapons and ballistic missile programs, which, despite statements by the State Department recently, I think are going on unobstructed.
Do you see a way out, Ambassador?
Well, not without a strategy to deal with not only the destruction of ISIS, which is necessary to prevent them from recruiting and deploying terrorists around the world, but to deal with the next and I think larger threat, Iran and the coalition it's put together. Right now we don't have that. I think the president has asked for it. I don't think it exists yet.
We just saw the president reject the deal that President Obama made with Cuba. What about the deal that President Obama made with Iran? Trump has criticized it relentlessly. Is this the next deal to fall, do you think?
Well, I certainly hope so. I'd have rejected it 5 months ago. It's a terrible deal from America's perspective. I think it's the worst international agreement we've negotiated in our history. I don't think Iran ever had the slightest intention of complying with it in any material respect. I don't think they're complying with its key provisions now. And I think that the risk that we're going to see throughout the region is only increasing with time.
Can he? Can he reject that deal? Is there a way out for him?
Of course. Of course. He snaps his fingers and says we're out of the deal. There's no deal ever made that can't be rejected by a subsequent leadership. And that's, in my view, what he should do here, explaining to the American people why it's a strategic debacle, why it harms our interest, why it threatens our friends like Israel and Arab states in the region, why Iran is not complying with it, why the relationship between Iran and North Korea's nuclear weapons and ballistic missile programs are threats. And I think he could lead us into a position where we can deal with this threat by Iran and also North Korea, which is growing ever more imminent.
Ambassador John Bolton, we appreciate your insight today. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Deadly wildfires raging out of control with flames trapping people in their cars, and the weather only making things worse. Plus, the congressional to-do list ahead of the summer recess, and health care reform is only one big-ticket item at stake for the GOP.
I would rather us do it right than do it fast, because no matter what passes, if it isn't good or it has some unintended consequence, the president is going to be held responsible for that. Republicans are going to be held responsible for that.
News alert on a deadly wildfire. Officials in Portugal say at least 62 people are dead after flames swept over a road in the central part of the country, trapping many victims in their cars. Hundreds of soldiers and firefighters are struggling to control the blaze amid high heat and bone-dry conditions. Investigators say a lightning strike likely triggered this inferno. Portugal has declared 3 days of mourning for the victims.
I'm not looking for a lesson. I want to support Otto.
Yes.
I want to support my other children, my community. I'm proud of the way everybody's handled this, and I'm so grateful that Otto's with us. He's with people who love him now. That means a lot to us.
And is Fred Warmbier, the father of American college student Otto Warmbier, speaking out after North Korea's surprise release of his son from a prison this past week. However, Otto Warmbier was released after apparently suffering severe brain injuries in captivity. That is now raising serious questions about what happened to the exchange student after his arrest in 2016 and about the remaining 3 Americans we know the rogue regime is currently detaining. Let's bring in now Ambassador Frank Lavin, CEO of Export Now, former U.S. ambassador to Singapore, and author of Homefront to Battlefront, an Ohio teenager in World War II. Ambassador, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Arthel.
Before we get started, have you spoken to Otto Warmbier's father or anyone directly connected to the family?
I have not, but I have to tell you, all over the nation today, we're celebrating, dads and kids are celebrating Father's Day. It's got to be a very poignant Father's Day there in Cincinnati for that family. They do have their son back and grateful for that, but the son has suffered grievous damage, and it's got to be a very painful moment for the father and the whole family.
Yeah, indeed, it has to be. And Ambassador, in addition to your personal feelings or emotions, what was your initial gut reaction answer to the political calculus behind the timing of the release of Otto Warmbier?
Well, my sense is that they realized that Otto had some very serious medical issues. He might even be facing death, and they wanted just to make sure that he was transported out of North Korea, so if there is some kind of ultimate consequence, it doesn't take place physically in their country. Nonetheless, they can certainly do that. Nonetheless, they have to bear all responsibility for the medical condition of this young man.
And what does that mean? How do they pay for that?
Well, I think that means a few things. One, I think it behooves the U.S. The U.S. government needs to make this a global human rights case, not just for Otto, but the other 3 Americans who are prisoners in North Korea. But this ought to be a UN issue. This ought to go to Amnesty International. This ought to be a human rights issue. But we need to elevate this issue to stigmatize North Korea and isolate them to make sure they fully understand that if they monkey with Americans, they are going to pay price. That's point number 1. Point number 2, we need to shut down these tour companies that take college kids into North Korea. They earn money off of these trips. These are very dangerous trips. There's going to be more Ottos if we don't do something to stop it. So I think it behooves the U.S. government to start to go after some of the airlines and the travel agents and so forth that are facilitating these journeys.
That's an excellent point, Ambassador. You know, of course, this raises the issue of not paying ransom for American hostages. Where do you stand on that policy?
No, I think that's very sound. If you do pay ransom, just think of this, Arthel, if you do pay ransom, you're really incentivizing the seizure of the next American. And they're going to find another American hitchhiker or somebody, they're going to grab that guy. So I'd be very, very careful about going down that path.
You know, if politicians continue to publicly fight about which side has a better record or will to negotiate the return of American hostages, doesn't this display, this display of such divide, Ambassador, give leverage to potential hostage takers? I mean, the political cards are out on the table, and the bad guys know which ones to play.
Yeah, I don't think this is a partisan issue, and I think you're exactly right. If we approach it as a partisan issue, it doesn't help us. We have a weaker negotiating position. I think the U.S. has the moral high ground here. I think we have the political high ground. We do need to play some cards. And I'll tell you another point we need to make is this feeds into our general representation to China that they are providing assistance to a bad actor. Normally when we talk to China, it's about North Korea's nuclear program. That's a very valid point. But this also reminds us these fellows are just a repressive regime, North Korea. They are bad news, and China needs to step up to its responsibility as North Korea's largest trading partner and economic benefactor. And today was this poor Otto's condition was deteriorating. I'll tell you something else I suspect. We'll have a medical examiner look at this. But I suspect one of the reasons, if he was in a sort of coma or in a bad shape for an extended period of time, the North Koreans wanted to wait several months until whatever bruises or physical evidence of mistreatment had faded from his body, so they couldn't return him to his parents if he was still black and blue, or there's still very good evidence that this fellow had been beaten or otherwise abused.
It's disgusting. And we end on, again, pointing out that these are real people, real families suffering and grieving over their son's condition, and we wish them well and hope there's an end to this massive.
Thank you, Art. I agree wholeheartedly.
Yeah, okay. Ambassador Frank Lavin, thank you so much.
Now to the congressional agenda, and we're live on Capitol Hill, where there's a lot of unfinished business for lawmakers ahead of their annual summer recess. What's on the to-do list for the next few weeks, and how much can they actually get done? Ellison Barber is live in Washington. Ellison?
Congress has a significant to-do list, and one of the big items is, of course, health care. Republicans want to get that done before the August recess. The Senate says that they'd like to vote before July 4th, but the legislation is not done. Senate Republicans are the majority, but just barely, and not every Republican is a definitive yes. According to The Hill, last week, Senator Rand Paul told a group of reporters, quote, "I'm more than willing to vote for partial repeal if I can't get a complete repeal, but I'm not willing to vote for new Republican entitlement programs." Finding votes among Democrats isn't going to be easy either.
I think that the Democrats in the Congress should do everything possible, A, to defeat that legislation, which is, again, to my mind, unspeakable. How do you throw 23 million people off of health insurance?
In addition to health care, there's immigration and also tax reform.
There's a component of it that I'm working with Ivanka Trump on, which is the pro-family component of it. We'll have a meeting this week with her and a number of senators and House members to begin to lay out that portion of the agenda. But I do think tax reform, these things can work simultaneously. You don't have to wait to finish on health care before you start formulating ideas on tax reform, and that's happening right now.
Some Republicans say regardless of the legislation, right now the Senate is simply too slow.
The House of Representatives, we've passed numerous bills, lots of great deregulation. Tax reform's it's already started in the House. It's the Senate. It's that simple. They are slow, and they need to get off of their tails and pass something.
And Fox News has learned that Democrats are planning to take shifts giving speeches on health care. Those speeches could go well into the night and last for weeks. Rick?
But now they play baseball together, Ellison, so everything should be fine.
Sometimes it helps.
Thank you, Ellison Barber,
You bet.
in Washington.
Well, new plans for Afghanistan ramping up, with President Trump giving Defense Secretary Jim Mattis the authority to set troop levels there. Are we winning this war? We'll talk about that. Plus, Senator John McCain on the high price already paid by U.S. forces.
The sacrifice of these heroes is a painful reminder that America is still a nation at war. That is true in Afghanistan, where after 15 years of war, we face a stalemate and urgently need a change in strategy and an increase in resources
There was an officer-involved shooting on the Bay Bridge in California, closing several eastbound lanes this morning. We're told highway patrol officers were responding to an accident when another car approached and did not slow down, forcing one officer to open fire. The suspect was hit at least once and was taken to the hospital. No word yet on his condition.
The war in Afghanistan is ramping back up, with President Trump giving the Pentagon authority to set troop levels there. And with reports, the Pentagon will send nearly 4,000 more troops to the front lines. This would be the largest deployment of American manpower under the Trump presidency. All this, as Defense Secretary Jim Mattis told lawmakers the other day, we are losing the battle there. Joining us to discuss is Lieutenant Colonel Mitch Utterback. He's a former Special Forces officer in the U.S. Army. Mitch, thanks for being with us.
Hey, Rick.
I want to start with this. There was another unfortunate green-on-blue attack this week. Afghan soldier, trained by U.S. forces, turns his weapons on the troops trying to help and wounded 7 of them. How does this shake the resolve of our men and women on the ground there?
Rick, it doesn't. What it just means is you got to watch your counterparts a little closer. We have duty positions called Guardian Angels, troops specifically dedicated to watching the Afghans. That's never been a problem in Iraq either. It's specific to Afghanistan, and I know our men and women over there are paying attention to this, but there's guns everywhere. And an Afghan could easily pick up a weapon that's leaning against the wall in a meeting and open fire. They get the drop on us a little quicker than we can get the drop on them. And as you know, hundreds of Americans have been killed this way over the last several years.
It's awful. Now, Senator John McCain, back to this troop surge. He says we need a strategy. Is there one? What is the U.S. goal at this point?
Well, Rick, just last week, like you said, the SecDef said we're not winning, and the Pentagon is putting together a strategy this summer, a strategy, a whole of government strategy, diplomacy, information, the military aspect and the economic aspect, something that we really haven't known that we've had in the last several years. So we have to be patient to see what this whole of government strategy is, but it really has to be a reconciliation with the Taliban. Afghanistan is so remote. It's like the far side of the moon in some places. They need to have a reconciliation with the Taliban and come to some kind of agreement. We need to be there to help them.
But, Colonel, you have very specific ideas on what these troops should be doing there in terms of taking the fight to the Taliban.
That's right. You wouldn't recognize Afghanistan, Rick, from the times that you've been there. It's almost like a ghost town on those bases. Barely enough troops to keep the lights on. I left there in 2015 with less than 10,000 troops. Really staying inside the bases, only special forces leaving the wire to take the fight to the enemy. This, probably a brigade plus size element, is going to advise at a more tactical level. We need to get shoulder to shoulder with the Afghan soldiers doing the fighting to be able to call in airstrikes for them, bring in the surveillance assets, and call in medevac. Afghanistan hardly has any of this. Afghans fight harder when there's an American advisor standing shoulder to shoulder, bringing all those combat enablers, we call them, to bear against the Taliban.
But, Colonel, Afghan forces lost 5,000 men last year alone. General Mattis says the Taliban had a very good year, and they're on track for another very good year. So where are these new Afghan troops coming from? And at what point do we just say enough's enough?
Rick, I think probably during this administration we may have to say enough's enough, but we do have to give an opportunity for the Secretary of Defense and the administration to come up with the best strategy we've ever had. But Afghan troops drive down dirt roads in Ford Ranger pickup trucks. They don't have the protection, the firepower that we are used to seeing from other conflicts, specifically like what the Iraqi forces have. It's a very, very difficult area to fight. And one problem is some of these guys they live in another part of the country, and they're not that fully invested to fight and die on the other side of the country when their family lives on the east side and they're fighting in the west. A strategy where Afghans from the local area are brought into the military and posted there will make them fight harder.
Yeah, commitment is obviously an issue. What's the worst thing that can happen if we did leave? Does Afghanistan become another Iraq, fall into ISIS? Does this mean that we can't leave and we're stuck there for decades? What do you see?
If we decide during this administration that enough's enough, and the American people decide enough's enough, I do think we'll have to maintain a special operations presence with the ability to continue to take out high-value targets, to not allow terrorists and terrorist organizations that could rise and threaten the West, threaten Europe, threaten the United States, ever to rise again like al-Qaeda once had. But at some point, we may get to the point where Afghanistan has to manage its own internal security. Something else, though, we need to re-look at our relationship with Pakistan, who provides the safe haven for the Taliban. You don't have an insurgency without a safe haven, and Pakistan is part of the problem.
Lieutenant Colonel Mitch Utterback, thanks very much for your time today. We appreciate your insight.
Thanks, Rick.
The family of a missing Pearl Harbor sailor finally getting the closure and answers they have wanted for more than 75 years. Plus, a contentious race brewing in Georgia for a vacant House seat. We are less than 48 hours away from a vote that could affect the balance